He remembered the fury that had clouded his mind when Balon Greyjoy first declared himself king of the Iron Islands, remembered the bloodshed that followed. The stag had marched then, a fury of steel and righteous vengeance in the name of a still young Iron Throne. Eddard Stark had walked beside him, grim and unyielding in his own sense of duty, with Baratheon bannermen filling every ship, every step, until they bristled with soldiers upon the beaches of the Iron Islands. Robert Baratheon, fresh from his triumph in Robert's rebellion, would not tolerate the Ironborn rising up in open defiance mere years after he had claimed the throne. He had told Balon that there would be no mercy, but there had been a sliver of leniency in him back then, enough to spare the Greyjoy line if they bent the knee and offered proper hostages. When the war ended, when Pike's towers were shattered and the Kraken sigil was torn, Balon Greyjoy had bent the knee. His oldest sons had died in the fighting, the survivors had been cast down, and Theon, the last living son and heir, had been given over to Eddard Stark. In the aftermath, Robert had accepted a half-apology, a vow of fealty, and the war had ended. The realm had tasted enough blood for a time, he thought, and the Seven Kingdoms were weary of war. Yet years passed and trouble festered. On the Iron Islands, old reavings continued, concealed behind smugglers' coves and ill-fated coastal villages that never lived long enough to carry word of the raiders. Whispers of broken oaths and battered septs emerged. Robert, for all his bluff and iron muscle, was not a fool. Word came to him by the small folk fleeing westward by boat, seeking shelter in Lordsport or along the coastlines of the Reach. The lords at court whispered that the Ironborn saw themselves as separate and scorned king's justice. Gold cloaks who traveled as far as the Iron Islands returned with stories of restlessness, of the drowned men preaching that the Iron Throne was but a southern folly. And Robert bristled each time. Yet it was not until several fishing villages beneath the protection of House Farman were pillaged again and again, until children were snatched and sold, their fathers murdered, that King Robert Baratheon decided he could abide the Ironborn no more. He summoned his bannermen, not in a half measure as he had before, but with the full might of the crown behind him. A heavy responsibility weighed on him as he made the decision, for it meant a second war in his reign, but he reasoned that the last conflict had never fully ended. The Greyjoy rebellion had quieted, not concluded, and so began the final subjugation of the Iron Islands. The ravens flew out from King's Landing to Storm's End and Casterly Rock, to Highgarden and Riverrun, and even to the distant halls of Winterfell. The North might not have had a direct stake in that war, but Eddard Stark was Robert's brother in arms. Ned would come, if only to secure the hostage Theon Greyjoy and remind the boy what a father's treason wrought. The young man had grown into a half-northerner, uncertain of his identity, but now that would be tested. Every lord from every corner of the realm who owed fealty to the Iron Throne was told to stand ready. The king planned not just another slap on the wrist, not a mere punitive campaign. This time, Robert intended to break the Iron Islands for good. Ships were built in record numbers. The Redwyne fleet from the Arbor lent its proud war galleys. The Royal Fleet, still a fraction of what Aegon's navy had once been, was strengthened by sail sails from the Narrow Sea. Even the Lannisters contributed heavily to the cause, for Tywin Lannister had no love for the Ironborn and harbored a quiet anger that roiled behind his golden eyes. The Iron Islands had long been a thorn in his side, harrying Lannister domains up and down the coast. Now was his chance to see them rendered powerless. In King's Landing, the king's counselors cautioned him about the cost of another war so soon after the rebellion and the Greyjoy uprising. Varys spoke of how small folk in the Crownlands might whisper that the king was too fond of bloodshed, of how the realm might groan under new taxes. But Robert ignored those voices, or at best, humored them with a dismissive wave of his large, calloused hand. Grand Maester Pycelle wrung his hands, muttering how winter might come, or how new debts to the Iron Bank of Bravos might further weigh the crown's finances. Littlefinger, perched upon the small council, saw profit in war but recognized the risk. That day, Robert's booming voice silenced them all. The king had resolved to end this matter. He remembered the shrieks of orphans, the bodies left unburied on the beaches, reports that had found their way to his ears. He had not gone to war to free the Seven Kingdoms from Targaryen tyranny only to let a cluster of isles defy him. Late in the evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the red and gold sky spread over Blackwater Bay, Robert stood upon the walls of the Red Keep, gazing out at the ships that huddled like forest trees upon the water. For once, he was sober, or at least as sober as Robert could manage. His fists tightened on the stone parapet, and he whispered words only he could hear. "This time they yield or burn," he swore to the wind, though none but the gulls heard him. At dawn on the appointed day he sailed. The king's standard of the crowned stag flapped and billowed in the wind, joined by 100 other banners: gold lions of Lannister, golden roses of Tyrell, the falcon of Arryn, the twin towers of Frey, sigils from across the realm. Although each lord had his own reason to join, they were united under Robert's declared purpose: the permanent end to ironborn defiance. Some gnarled old men who had once pillaged the Stepstones as mercenaries said no man could truly conquer the Iron Islands, but Robert Baratheon planned to prove them wrong. When their ships finally appeared on the horizon outside Pike, like a shimmering curtain of sails, the Ironborn were ready to fight. Balon Greyjoy had not wasted the years since his first defeat. He had built new longships and refortified his seat. But no matter how proud Balon's black sails were, they were dwarfed by the might of the gathered royal fleet and the banners of lords who had joined the cause. The memory of old humiliations and defeats still stung for some houses, like the Harlows and the Botleys, but they had no illusions of beating the realm united, not with the Lannisters and Tyrells at Robert's beck and call. Balon's next choice should have been to surrender, but the Ironborn seldom learned humility easily. His captains had reaved half their lives, and many were still enthralled by the drowned god's promise that salt and iron would forever test the mainland's steel. Thus, in the first clash of war, near the Isle of Great Wyke, the Ironborn fought back. Bloody boarding actions saw men hurled into the sea, screaming, as iron axes bit into flesh. The sea turned red with gore. Robert himself, cased in plate, battered any man foolish enough to challenge him, holding his warhammer overhead as a sign that the king of the Undulls and the first men was present, personally leading the charge. Captain Victarion Greyjoy led his own black-sailed fleet, colliding with the crown's ships in a thunderous crash of wood and iron. For hours the carnage raged. The roar of cannons was absent, for Westeros had none, but catapults flung burning pitch, and scorpions loosed bolts that shattered hulls. Ultimately, numbers told. The Redwyne galleys, disciplined and cunning, flanked from the south, while the Lannister longships from Fair Isle came from the west, trapping the Ironborn squadrons in a crushing pincer. Victarion and some of the best fighters among the Kraken's followers cut their way free. Other longships sank into the cold sea, leaving broken planks and drowning men in their wake. It was the largest naval engagement in living memory, and while the royal fleet lost a great many good men, the Ironborn lost far more. Though battered, Robert pressed on to Pike, to Old Wyke, to every stony isle of that harsh archipelago. Bit by bit, the final subjugation took shape. Nobles who once wore the Kraken sigil bent the knee. Those who hesitated paid with their lives. Greyjoy's refusal to yield only spurred the mainlanders onward. Pike, that ancient fortress perched over the surging seas, saw its walls hammered by trebuchets ferried from Lordsport. Using the lessons learned from the first Greyjoy rebellion, the Crown's forces arrived well prepared with siege engines capable of striking from seaward vantage points. For days, the air was full of crashing stones and the stink of burning pitch. The Ironborn defenders fought viciously, loosing arrows and letting their catapults fling flaming casks. Robert's men responded in kind with concentrated bombardments. Often, the waves themselves caught fire. Black oil poured from the ramparts, igniting the surface. Even when men boiled alive in the sea, the assault did not relent. Balon Greyjoy finally stood upon the battlements in a fateful moment, gazing out at a horizon dominated by enemy sails. On the distant slopes behind Pike, tens of thousands of campfires glowed each evening, signaling that the armies of the mainland had indeed come in force. He had lost too many ships to break through. His defiance had sealed his people's fate, a truth that even his hot-tempered mind began to accept. But Balon was never a man to break easily. He had declared himself king. He had watched as the Iron Throne accepted his temporary surrender once before, and each day since, he had simmered with bitterness. To submit a second time was more than his pride could bear, yet the alternative was pure annihilation. The relentless pounding shook Pike's towers. More sections of the ancient keep crumbled, plunging into the sea below with thunderous crashes. The stony ground quaked and trembled with each impact. Corpses of his men littered the ramparts. The outer walls were in ruin. The main gate threatened to collapse. Each hour, roars of Baratheon men shook the battered fortress to its core. When the battered remains of Pike finally caved, Robert himself led the storming party, warhammer held high. He had taken a glancing strike from a reaver's axe a day earlier, and his pauldron was dented, but the Baratheon king seemed unstoppable. The ferocity in his eyes frightened even the bravest of Balon's men. If Eddard Stark's calm steel had been terrifying in its inevitability, Robert's brand of fury was like a roaring tempest. Beside him fought the Kingsguard, Barristan Selmy, white cloak billowing despite the grime and gore, his sword a flash of lethal grace, and Harry's SWFT, newly made to the white cloak, less famed than Barristan but proud to serve. A cluster of Stormlanders formed Robert's personal guard, and among them, House Tartha's knights in glittering gold-trimmed plate moved like an unbreakable phalanx. In that moment of final breach, Balon Greyjoy stood with a handful of loyal men, blades drawn, prepared to die. His armor was thick leather studded with iron, battered and smoke-stained, his face flecked with soot and blood. He was not the young man who had once soared in the heyday of the old Reavers. His hair was graying, his shoulders slumped under the weight of desperation. Yet hate still shone in his eyes, hate for the usurper who had come from the mainland to crush the ironborn spirit. Balon Greyjoy! Robert's voice echoed off the ruined walls as he advanced, stepping over broken timber and the smoking rubble of siege fire. Stand down. It's over. Balon spat, though his mouth was dry. Over for you, he rasped, forcing the words through the dryness of his throat. The Iron Islands were never yours to claim. Robert leveled his hammer. They will be, he promised. A hush seemed to settle over the crumbled yard. Then Balon lunged. He attacked the king directly, swinging a salt-rusted longsword with all the force of last-chance vengeance. Robert blocked it with a heavy clang, the blow jolting up both their arms, and hammered back. Two of Balon's men died almost instantly from the backswing of that great weapon, their skulls crushed. Greyjoy parried once, twice, but Robert's strength was legendary. When the king's hammer struck Balon's sword in a vicious overhead blow, the steel snapped. Balon's eyes widened in shock. A second blow came, smashing through his defenses and flinging him to the ground. There, pinned under the king's foot, Balon Greyjoy found himself for the second time in his life at Robert Baratheon's mercy. Around them, the battered remnants of Balon's men threw down their arms, or they were cut down as they tried to flee. The ring of steel on stone died away, replaced by the crackle of fires and the groans of the wounded. Robert stared down at the man who had so long vexed him, and in that moment, that same fleeting spark of mercy from the previous rebellion crossed Robert's mind. But it lasted no longer than a heartbeat. "Do you yield?" Robert thundered. Balon's defiant glare might have signaled refusal, but his voice was silent. Robert's gauntlet fist tightened on the haft of his warhammer. "The Iron Islands are mine," he said, "and you will never rebel again. If I spare you, you'll only stoke more unrest. If I kill you, your line ends, and so does the threat you pose. Which would you have me do?" Balon sputtered, coughing out a mouthful of blood. Defiance ran in him still, but so did survival instincts honed from years of reaving. He could see no path to victory. Yet Robert's question might have been rhetorical, for there was no sincerity in his tone. The king was done with half-measures. At that moment, Eddard Stark entered the courtyard. He was still cloaked in the dust and smoke of the siege. His sword was stained dark red, and his grim eyes took in the wreckage around them, resting finally on the defeated Greyjoy. The men parted to let the Lord of Winterfell pass. Ned was older too, lines creasing his face, but those gray eyes were unyielding. He said nothing at first. His presence was enough. Behind him came Theon Greyjoy, grown lean and tall in Winterfell's tradition, bearing witness to his father's defeat. The boy's face was ashen, caught between longing and dread. Balon managed to raise his head. "Theon," he gasped. His eyes flickered to the boy who had grown far from salt water. Robert sensed the moment's poignancy. He turned to Theon. "You wish to speak to your father?" There was a note of rough pity in his voice, for though Robert had come to despise Balon's pride, he had fought in many battles and knew the bitter taste of a final defeat. Theon swallowed, stepping forward with hesitant steps. For years, he had nursed a complicated mixture of resentment and pride when thinking of his true father. He wanted to prove himself worthy of the Stark household that had raised him, yet in his veins ran the blood of the Kraken. "Father," he said quietly, voice trembling, "yield. The Isles are lost. This need not end with everyone dead." Balon coughed, flecks of crimson at his lips. "A son of the Iron Islands begs for mercy?" The words were an accusation. He spat at the ground, face contorting in scorn. "You belong to them now, or maybe you belong nowhere." Theon flinched, but he set his jaw, meeting his father's gaze. "Then you doom yourself," he whispered. Robert let the silence linger a moment longer. Balon's face was twisted in hatred. There would be no kneeling, no begging, no final atonement. The last scrap of the Greyjoy's dignity refused to bend. Robert, with a sigh that carried the weight of all his regrets, raised his warhammer. "Then it ends." The blow that followed was swift and merciless, caving in Balon's chest. The king of the Iron Islands was dead. The watchers fell silent, though in the courtyard, no one was truly surprised. Robert had warned them all that no more would mercy be offered. Theon stood aghast, shocked at seeing his sire's death at the hands of the king he had grown to serve. Ned placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. In that courtyard, among the rubble, the new fate of the Iron Islands was decided. There would be no more House Greyjoy ruling from Pike, no more ironborn kings paying lip service to the Iron Throne. House Greyjoy was effectively ended. Theon remained the sole surviving child, but no one spoke in that hour of giving him lordship over the Isles. Robert had come with the intent to subjugate the Iron Islands absolutely and turn them into a crown colony under Baratheon rule, and that was what he would do. The final pockets of resistance on the other isles, Great Wyke, Harlow, Blacktide, Saltcliffe, collapsed within days. With Balon dead, the Ironborn captains lost heart or tried to slip away in longships under the cover of night. Some chose to fight to the bitter end, crowning themselves lords of their own worthless islands, only to be hunted down by Lannister or Tyrell warships. The mania for defiance died in an avalanche of swords and siege engines. Bit by bit, the archipelago fell silent under mainland dominion. When the dust settled, Robert did not cede the region back to any local lord. He named no Greyjoy to succeed, nor did he empower any lesser Ironborn houses to take their seat as overlords. Instead, in the presence of his lords paramount and the battered survivors of the Ironborn leadership, he proclaimed the Iron Islands to be directly under the governance of the Iron Throne. They would be reorganized with a royal governor selected by the king himself. Any local laws or traditions that contradicted the crown's will would be stripped away. The worship of the drowned god would not be outlawed outright. Robert was not a zealot, but open defiance in the name of that faith would be punished as treason. Many across Westeros were shocked. It was not unknown for Aegon the Conqueror or the Targaryens to subjugate rebellious lords, but Robert was taking it further. The Iron Islands would become, in essence, a colony ruled directly by the crown, answerable only to the king. No puppet lord, no illusions of autonomy. The war was done, and Robert meant to ensure no more uprisings rose from that bitter corner of the realm. The days and weeks after Pike's fall were grim. The victory celebrations were muted by the high cost in lives. Men walked the beaches searching for their brothers among the dead. Funeral pyres lined the shores, smoke curling into the slate-gray skies. The stench of rotting carrion was everywhere, and flocks of gulls circled overhead, gorging themselves. Still, the king worked quickly. He was never the sort for careful administration, but he recognized the need to move fast and show the ironborn who was in charge. He made a series of proclamations from the battered courtyard of Pike, once Balon's seat of power. Henceforth, taxes owed from the Iron Islands would be paid directly to the crown. All new ships built there must be registered with the king's master of ships. The wearing of arms and armor by any ironborn not part of an approved militia would be severely restricted. Hostages would be taken from every notable ironborn family, sons and daughters, sent to King's Landing or Storm's End to ensure future good behavior. This was not a rehash of Theon's wardship. This was broader, systematic. Robert wanted to place an entire generation under the watchful eyes of loyalist households. For the local lords, Harlow, Goodbrother, Blacktide, Valmark, and others, Robert declared them to retain their lands only if they bent the knee. Those who had participated in open rebellion lost their seats and would be replaced by crown-appointed castellans. The wailing of dispossessed ironborn families filled the halls of their keeps. Yet none could say the king had not warned them. In truth, many ironborn saw the fate as worse than mere defeat. Their autonomy and ancient culture had been strangled in a single stroke, and they would be forced to bow to a new, foreign administration with no end in sight. By King Robert's command, the first governor of the Iron Islands was to be a Baratheon cousin, Ser Renford Baratheon, a lesser branch scion, known more for his loyalty than for any cunning. Renford was no genius, but he was dependable, and Robert trusted him not to defy the crown's edicts. His seat would be at Pike, half-ruined though it was. The king ordered the fortress partially rebuilt, but not in the old ironborn manner of precarious rope bridges and tall, wind-whipped towers. Robert wanted a keep more akin to Storm's End, stout and unassailable. He would see the Iron Islands tamed. If an entire generation of ironborn children had to grow up under the shadow of a foreign keep, so be it. Robert would not risk a third uprising. In the first month after conquest, the Iron Islands lay quiet as the hush after a dreadful storm. The main portion of Robert's forces departed, some by sea, some by land, returning to their home domains. Many carried new scars, some boasted loot taken from the broken keeps. A skeleton garrison remained under Governor Renford's command, augmented by the presence of a detachment of the Gold Cloaks. Repurposed as wardens of the Isles Lannister and Redwyne ships still patrolled the surrounding waters, ensuring no resurgence of piracy would take hold. Robert himself lingered a few weeks more. He roamed the Isles with a retinue that included Barristan Selmy and a handful of other trusted knights. He had seen the devastation left in the siege's wake, seen the hungry small folk rummaging for scraps, the burned fishing skiffs, the ravaged farmland that was never abundant to begin with. This was what it meant to crush rebellion once and for all. He had to face the consequences. In some ways, it sobered him. The notion of a swift, glorious campaign was replaced by the reality of orphans and widows, of a generation that would resent the Iron Throne for crimes both real and perceived. But Robert pressed on, steeled by the conviction that this was necessary. The Ironborn had never been content to simply bend. They needed to be broken. Eddard Stark took Theon with him back to Winterfell, though the boy was sullen, eyes hollow from watching his father die. Robert did not protest. Part of him wondered if sending Theon back might cause trouble later, but it was simpler to keep the boy away. Theon was no threat without the Ironborn behind him, and if Theon's presence in the north kept the rest of the Isles subdued, so much the better. The king eventually set sail for King's Landing, leaving behind a newly minted colony under the watchful eye of a loyal governor and the promise of harsh retribution should rebellion stir again. The Iron Islands had changed hands many times in their long, bloody history. Rebellions, conquests, half-hearted subjugations, but never before had they been so thoroughly stripped of autonomy. Word spread throughout Westeros of this new arrangement. Some lords whispered that the king's triumph would embolden him to do likewise with any future troublemakers. Others worried about the crown's finances, pointing out that stationing a permanent garrison was costly. But the king's men boasted that the days of ironborn terror on the seas were done. No longer would fishermen along the western coasts cower at the sound of distant war horns, or watch the horizon for black sails. The realm, they said, had peace. Yet, for the ironborn themselves, the transition was anything but peaceful. The new Crown Colony administration quickly established order, strict, uncompromising order. Soldiers patrolled the docks. The only ships allowed to sail freely were those with charters from Governor Renford or the King's Master of Ships. Any rumors of reaving were investigated harshly. If a reaver was found, they were hanged without ceremony. If an entire village was suspected of supporting reavers, it might be collectively punished. The Crown's men did not go to the extent of wholesale slaughters. Robert was done with that, but the threat was always there. Many ironborn tried to flee the Isles, seeking refuge across the narrow sea or on the stepstones, but it was not easy to escape the blockade. Some did manage to slip away in the night, forging new lives as sell-sales or mercenaries. Still, the majority had no means to leave. They stayed, resentful and proud, forced to kneel before a foreign occupation that they saw as an affront to all that was salt and iron. Governor Renford tried to enforce a gentler approach than might be expected from the king's direct fury, offering some concessions. Local clans would keep their own minor traditions if they caused no harm. But the pillars of ironborn independence, like building war galleys and launching raids, were strictly outlawed. In the following months, as the new chain of command solidified, 1,000 little dramas unfolded on every island. A Botley lord who had quickly surrendered found that half his men chafed under the new taxes. A small cove on Harlow was discovered smuggling arms. A good brother cousin was caught plotting a minor uprising, storing black market weapons in hidden sea caves. The Crown's men responded swiftly. Some who were caught were sent to the dungeons beneath Pike or carried away to the Red Keep for trial. Others simply disappeared, rumored to have been thrown into the sea. Fear spread among the populace, and in that fear, reluctant compliance. A trickle of septons arrived from the mainland, fresh off battered ships, to try and reintroduce the faith of the Seven to these stony shores. They found themselves unwelcome, but guarded by Crown soldiers. More quietly, a few ironborn peasants, desperate for a better life, attended these septs and prayed for calmer waters. The drowned men, outraged, retreated deeper into secret gatherings, swearing that the day of reckoning would come when the drowned god's wrath crashed upon the infidels. But for now they waited powerless. Governor Renford's seat at Pike was a swirl of administrative nightmares. Daily, he received petitioners complaining of broken fishing nets, stolen livestock, or Crown soldiers demanding bribes. Renford, not the most adept politician, struggled to balance the king's harsh directives with the day-to-day governance needed to keep the islands from outright starvation. He established tax collectors, scribes, and guardsmen, many of them men from the Stormlands or Crownlands loyal to House Baratheon. He also placed ironborn men of proven loyalty in lesser positions, hoping to quell their worst resentments. The early months were rough. The governor wrote often to King's Landing, pleading for shipments of grain or coin to keep the Isles from erupting. Littlefinger, as master of coin, saw to it that some funds were sent, though not always enough. The Crown was deep in debt from the war, and with winter looming on the horizon, resources were stretched. Renford found one small mercy in Maester Fallis, an older man assigned by the Citadel to the new administration. Fallis kept meticulous records, guided local healing efforts, and sought to curb the worst abuses by the Crown soldiers, urging clemency when possible. Often, Fallis was ignored by the more zealous officials, but his presence helped keep things from boiling over. Even a modicum of justice can ease a conquered people's pain, though not by much. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Robert sat upon the Iron Throne, presiding over the realm that, for the moment, was more united than it had been in decades. But the king's mood grew restless. He had expected the subjugation of the Iron Islands to lift a burden from his shoulders, yet it replaced it with the tedium of daily rulership. Courtiers came to him complaining about the cost of supply ships, about uprisings, about the moral quandaries of a heavy occupation. His eyes would glaze over, and he'd grunt that if they disliked it, they could go join the drowned men. Sometimes he longed for the battlefield again. There, at least, solutions were simple. The Warhammer solved all. But in a king's hall, problems sprouted Hydra-like from every vantage. Cersei Lannister, Robert's queen, found herself quietly pleased with the arrangement. The Lannisters had profited from the shipping lanes now safe from ironborn raids, and Tywin was proud to see a longtime enemy subdued. Yet tension remained in the Red Keep. The new colony was a major expense, and the longer the occupation wore on, the more it would cost. Cersei harped on about the expense, but Robert cared more for the quiet that had settled on the western coasts. Tyrion Lannister, though not officially part of the small council, hovered around King's Landing, offering the occasional pithy comment. He surmised that the Ironborn would never truly integrate, that they would resent the crown for generations, that the presence of mainland soldiers would breed rebellion anew. But for now, no one wanted to listen to a dwarf's cynicism. They reveled in the fact that the Iron Islands were quiet, or as quiet as they had ever been. Across Westeros, small folk learned that the once dreaded Ironborn were now under a gauntlet fist. This was a time of relief for the coastal villages of the Reach, the Westerlands, and the Riverlands especially. Merchant ships sailed with greater confidence, though always with caution for hidden coves that might harbor rogue Ironborn reavers. Still, the blockade and the Crown's new laws made piracy a rarer thing than it had been in many years. As the seasons turned, Governor Renford's rule faced its first genuine crisis. A famine threatened the archipelago. The Iron Islands, never abundant, had seen farmland ruined by the fighting. Many fishing boats were destroyed. The Crown's supply shipments arrived irregularly, often delayed by storms or by unscrupulous merchants who demanded higher prices for ferrying goods to a region known for tension. Faced with potential mass starvation, Renford wrote frantic letters to King's Landing, while the Ironborn looked upon him with mounting hatred. "You brought us to this," they told him. "We reaved before, but we never starved in our own homes. You burnt our boats. Now you would watch us die." When word reached Robert of this impending famine, the king bristled at the notion that the Ironborn might blame him. Yet he realized it would do him no good to let them starve outright. If the archipelago died, there would be no taxes to collect, no colony to rule. He commanded that the Tyrells of Highgarden send grain by sea. The grain indeed arrived, but the process was slow and not free of corruption. Some shipments disappeared. Others arrived half-rotten. Ironborn small folk starved in the winter months, huddling in meager huts or the burned shells of old keeps. The drowned men used this suffering as a clarion call, whispering that the king had come to destroy their way of life. Midway through that winter, a small rebellion flickered into life on Harlow. A cluster of outraged Ironborn attacked Crown soldiers posted near a fishing village. They killed 24 men, seized their arms, and retreated to a hidden cove. In years past, they might have sailed out in reaver ships to strike back at the Crown. But the blockade and the new laws made that difficult. Instead, they took to land-based raiding, slinking along the shores to sabotage supply convoys. Governor Renford acted swiftly, dispatching 100 well-armed loyalists to track them down. Locals refused to talk, out of fear or defiance. The rebels, who called themselves the Sons of Salt, began to carve out a certain folk hero status among impoverished small folk. The Crown's men eventually cornered the Sons of Salt in a half-collapsed watchtower near the western cliffs of Harlow. After a brief skirmish, the rebels were taken prisoner or killed. Renford traveled personally to oversee their punishment, hoping to deter further unrest. He had them dragged to the outskirts of the nearest village and hanged in a row, leaving their bodies to rot as a warning. This brutal display was in line with Robert's original edict: crush any rebellion without mercy. Yet the effect was less quelling than Renford hoped. Instead of cowering, some Ironborn quietly seethed, muttering that each fallen rebel would be a martyr to the drowned god. They waited for a day the tide might turn. Such pockets of resistance continued here and there, ephemeral and disorganized. Without a true leader, the Ironborn cause was scattered, and Governor Renford's troops kept the new colony under control. But hatred brewed beneath the surface, and even a king's edict could not quell that. Months slipped by, turning to years. The battered towers of Pike were rebuilt under mainland designs: thicker walls, a stable yard wide enough for a decent cavalry muster, even though cavalry was hardly used on these rocky isles. The rope bridges linking the towers were replaced with heavier stone causeways, more practical and less prone to sabotage. Ironborn workers were coerced into labor, sometimes at the end of a spear. Over time, the fortress began to resemble a hybrid of Storm's End's robust architecture and the old Pike's jagged silhouette. Renford lived there with his household knights, holding audience in a refurbished hall that lacked the cold grandeur of the old Greyjoy seat. Occasionally, a raven from the Red Keep arrived, demanding updates on tax collection or new measures to ensure maritime security. As the Crown's colony, the Iron Islands were expected to pay not only for their own upkeep but also to justify the expense of the garrison. The local lords who had bent the knee, Lord Harlow, Lord Goodbrother, Lord Blacktide, and others, found themselves effectively reduced to middlemen, forced to gather taxes for a foreign power. Some tried to cheat, hiding some portion of the harvest or the meager coin minted from local trade. But the governor's men discovered such treachery more often than not, and the penalty was harsh. Thus the weight of mainland rule bore down on the Ironborn. Resentments smoldered like embers, but the heavy rainfall of crown authority tamped down any open blaze. Some islanders tried to adapt, turning to less violent forms of livelihood, fishing, trade, crafts. Others simply bided their time, believing that one day, a new hero would rise to cast off Baratheon shackles. Many outwardly complied, greeting Crown officials with forced smiles while cursing them in private. The Crown hoped that, over generations, the islanders would gradually become more akin to other Westerosi, if only by constant exposure to mainland rule. Far to the north, Theon Greyjoy was no closer to reconciling his identity. He had grown into a ward of House Stark, forging friendships with Robb Stark while struggling with the memories of his father's death. News traveled slowly, but Theon heard of the Iron Islands' fate, how they were no longer a quasi-independent region, but effectively a subject colony. Pike was governed by a Baratheon cousin, their ships restricted, their proud families hostage to the Iron Throne. Theon felt a hollow ache. Part of him resented Robert for that final blow, but he had lived among the Starks long enough to see that the Ironborn's own obstinacy had led them down this path. He wrote letters to Governor Renford, offering politely to help mediate, but they went largely ignored. The king and his council had no interest in elevating Theon to a leadership role, not after they had spent so many resources crushing his father's line. In King's Landing, Robert consoled himself with the knowledge that the seas were quieter. The Western lords in particular expressed gratitude that trade flourished. The realm's grand old families sometimes muttered about how forcibly subjugating the Iron Islands might someday backfire, but for the present, it was a success. Crown income rose, ironically, because the Western trade routes were safer, and the cost of stationing troops decreased after the initial wave. New trade deals with the free cities brought coin into the Crown's coffers. The entire realm, from the Gift in the north to the Dornish Sands in the south, believed the Iron Islands were effectively a tamed province. Some even joked that it would become the Eighth Kingdom, if only by force. Governor Renford's continued presence on the Isles led to a measure of grudging acceptance among the small folk, though the discontented radicals still lurked in remote coves. Renford's approach, tempered by long experience and a desire not to incite further bloodshed, saw him occasionally negotiate small requests. If an Ironborn clan needed resources to repair a wharf, he authorized it. If a local fisherman was found with illicit arms, he might be whipped and set free instead of hanged. This was not out of any affection for the Ironborn. Renford was no champion of their cause, but out of a sense that the king wanted a functioning colony, not a wasteland. And so, slowly, the newly shaped Pike became the administrative heart of the colony. A council of appointed officials, largely mainland men, made decisions on shipping, trade, and local disputes. Where once the local lords or the Greyjoys had decided matters, now a foreign council handled them, often collecting fees. The humiliation for proud Ironborn families was severe, but with each passing year, it became a daily reality. The price for rising against the Iron Throne too many times. Balon Greyjoy's death became something of a legend among the islanders. Stories circulated of how their rightful king had stood defiant till the last breath. Some embellished the tale, claiming Balon nearly slew Robert in single combat. Others blamed Theon for not aiding his father. In truth, no version changed the present. The Greyjoy name had lost its seat. If Theon had any claim, it was recognized by no one of power. Robert's hammered justice had permanently changed the course of Iron Island's history. In the dryness of official records kept by Maester Fallis, it was noted that in the 3rd year after the subjugation, the Iron Islands saw their first half-peaceful harvest in decades. The farmland was meager, but with mainland supplies and some improved farming techniques introduced from the Reach, the small folk gleaned just enough to keep themselves from starvation. Fishing was slowly revived with new ships, albeit under Crown oversight. Harbors that had been blackened by war began to see commerce again, though on a smaller scale than before. Simultaneously, old customs eroded. The proud reaving culture was systematically dismantled. The so-called Old Way was forced underground, with even some ironborn families quietly denouncing the practice of taking salt wives or reaving as archaic barbarism. Younger generations, lacking the actual experience of reaving or the direct memory of autonomy, began to see themselves more as part of the realm, for better or worse. At the same time, a fervent minority refused to forget. They idolized the days of Euron Greyjoy or Victarion, of harrowing the seas in black-sailed longships. They whispered that one day the drowned god would raise a new champion who would toss the Baratheon usurpers into the sea. But for the time being, they had no power to stir open conflict. In King's Landing, the courtiers eventually grew tired of the Iron Islands as a subject of conversation. It became, for many, a dull footnote. The Crown Colony, as it was called, required maintenance and coin, but it was stable. Other matters, both at court and abroad, caught the realm's attention. Tales of dragons stirring in the east, rumors of Dothraki hordes, the endless complexities of the Crown's debt, alliances and marriages among the great houses. These overshadowed the Isles. Robert himself found a measure of satisfaction, telling war stories of the Second Greyjoy Rebellion. Over cups of wine, he boasted how he had ended Balon's tyranny once and for all. He left the day-to-day headaches to his small council, caring little for the slow burn of resentment across the sea. Governor Renford, for his part, received fewer instructions from King's Landing as time passed. The message was clear: keep the Isles in check, ensure taxes flow, do not let the reaving culture rise again. So he did. He clamped down on dissent where he could, confiscated or destroyed any unauthorized ships, and maintained a steady flow of gold back to the Crown's treasury. He listened to Maester Fallis only insofar as it helped keep peace enough to fulfill the king's commands. Oddly enough, the largest transformation came not from the Crown's stern decrees, but from the slow infiltration of mainland life into the daily routines of the Ironborn. Soldiers stationed there married local women, forging small familial ties. Merchants from the Reach and Westerlands, once terrified of the Ironborn, set up stalls to trade salted fish, seaweed, and the meager exports of the islands for mainland grain and manufactured goods. The faith of the Seven built modest septs in certain villages, drawing small but steady congregations who sought respite from the gloom of the drowned god's worship. Even the architecture began to change, as mainland-style houses replaced older, squat structures burned in the sieges. Still, the islands would never quite be the same as the rest of Westeros. Stark, windswept coastlines, black basalt cliffs, the smell of salt in every breath. These things would never fade. The older generation kept the old ways in their hearts, teaching their children stories of the Ironborn kings of yore, hoping that someday the tide might shift again. But that someday seemed distant indeed, with the Crown's galleys circling the waters and mainland soldiers manning the ramparts of Pike. By the 5th year of Robert's direct rule, it was accepted fact across the 7 kingdoms that the Iron Islands were no longer a great seat of defiance. No new Greyjoy had emerged. No new pretender had rallied the Ironborn banners. Instead, the Isles functioned like a conquered province, quiet, grudging, but contributing to the realm's coffers and no longer a threat. If Robert's plan had been to break the Isles forever, he had succeeded well enough. If the Ironborn Old Guard hated him, they were too cowed to act on it. Though the arrangement cost the Crown in administrative overhead, there were benefits. Piracy along the western coast dipped to an all-time low. The Lannisters were pleased with the reduction in raids. The Tyrells benefited from safer shipping lanes to the Reach. House Hightower of Old Town grew wealthy from expanded sea trade. Even House Manderley in the north saw improvements in shipping. For the first time in living memory, the Ironborn were not a looming menace. King Robert occasionally entertained the notion of touring the Isles in peacetime to see what had become of his triumph. But he never made the journey. The novelty had worn off, and he preferred to remain in the Red Keep or travel to Harrenhal or Highgarden for feasts and hunts. A measure of contentment settled in him, for if the realm was largely stable, he could enjoy the pleasures of being king without worry of immediate war. Sure, he had the trifling concerns of court, the whispers of Targaryen remnants across the sea, but the Iron Islands no longer plagued his mind. In private, Eddard Stark once questioned him on the moral aspect of holding an entire region in thrall. "You've effectively chained them," Ned observed. "Is that truly peace?" Robert, drunk on strong wine, let out a harsh laugh. "It's more peace than they ever gave us, Ned. They reaved and raided for centuries, burned our villages, took our people as thralls. Now they're paying for it. If they truly want to join the realm as proper subjects, I've left the door open. The ones who cling to their savage ways can rot. At least the rest of Westeros can breathe freely." Ned's face was troubled, but he did not press the point. He still remembered the corpses on the beaches, the villages put to the torch. Perhaps there was a grim justice in Robert's iron-fisted approach, though it left a sour taste. He nodded, conceding that, for the moment, the realm was safer. And so time marched on. The old soared off into the pages of history, replaced by the day-to-day administration of the Crown's newest territory. Young men from the mainland grew into middle age serving on the Iron Islands, forging careers in the name of the king. The next generation of islanders, meanwhile, lived under an occupying force, some choosing to adapt, some dreaming of one day reclaiming their freedom. Such was the legacy of Robert's conquest. At Pike, Governor Renford's hold on power solidified. He invited a small group of ironborn notables to form an advisory council, hoping to ease tensions. Although many came reluctantly, a few families saw an opportunity to gain favor with the crown. By aligning themselves with the new colonial administration, these opportunistic ironborn could gain special privileges, like shipping licenses or farmland grants. The seeds of a new class of loyalist ironborn emerged, despised by traditionalists but tolerated by the crown. One such figure was Donner Harlaw, a lesser cousin of House Harlaw's main branch. Donner quickly discovered that if he proved his loyalty to the crown, the governor would reward him with certain monopolies, like the import of barley or the right to operate tolls at certain docks. This gave Donner wealth and influence among the impoverished Isles, though it earned him the quiet hatred of his kin. Over time, Donner's success seemed to exemplify the new order. Those who cooperated might find themselves better off, while those who clung to the old ways languished. In bits and pieces, the Isles' culture began to shift, pressed by foreign rule and internal divisions. Young men who once might have taken up the oar for reaving found themselves working in newly built shipyards under mainland overseers, constructing merchant vessels or smaller warships for the crown. They were paid wages, which was novel for a society so accustomed to taking what they wanted by force. Some nights, in taverns built near the docks, these men complained over watered ale that they had lost the sense of identity their fathers had bequeathed them. But the next day they would return to work, for they needed coin to feed their families. The drowned men, once influential advisors to the Greyjoy kings, found themselves marginalized. They still performed baptisms in salt water, still prayed in hidden coves, but they held none of the old sway. Mainland rule discouraged them, suspecting them of fueling rebellious sentiments. Any open talk of crowning a new ironborn king was labeled sedition. Many fled or pretended to adopt the faith of the Seven, though some quietly preached that the Isles must endure this occupation as a test from the drowned god. When foreign merchants or mainland officials walked the villages, they were sometimes met with sullen glares, but rarely open violence. The islanders had seen that the crown responded to violence with swift retribution. The memory of those mass hangings lingered, Better to keep one's mouth shut and hope the mainland men left quickly. The occupation was not gentle, but it was stable, and stability was better than war for most small folk. Each year, a handful of reavers tested their luck, venturing out in old longships to raid unsuspecting coasts. They often found themselves hunted down by crown warships, outnumbered and outmatched. Those few who escaped capture might seize a small prize from a coastal hamlet, but the days of grand reavings, of bringing back thralls and silver from the mainland, were dead. Thus, the reaving tradition withered. Younger men who tried to cling to it often ended up at the end of a rope. Slowly, inexorably, the Iron Islands were molded in the shape of a mainland colony, reliant on the crown's good graces. This transformation did not happen overnight, and it was not total. In the hidden corners of Great Wyke or deep within the labyrinthine caves of Old Wyke, some ironborn families kept their old ways alive in secret, paying homage to drowned god idols, stockpiling axes and stolen sails. But these pockets were small, and the monarchy had no tolerance for letting them grow. The new system, with its constant patrols, local informants, and mainland-friendly lords, crushed each sprout of rebellion before it could blossom. Back in King's Landing, Robert Baratheon aged. He held tourneys, drank heavily, hunted in the Kingswood. The events on the Iron Islands faded from the forefront of his mind. He had accomplished his aim. The Isles no longer threatened his realm. In taverns across Westeros, singers might still compose ballads about the Greyjoy rebellion, but the final verse was always the same. King Robert hammered Balon Greyjoy into dust, and the Ironborn were forced under the crown's heel. In the grand sweep of history, it would be recorded as a major turning point. No longer were there 7 kingdoms plus 1 rebellious region. Now it was 7 kingdoms and 1 crown colony. The Ironborn were forcibly integrated. While some historians would later criticize the brutality and the imposition of mainland customs on a proud maritime people, none could deny that the realm was more unified. For better or worse, Robert's approach had ended an age-old threat, and so the Iron Islands remained, caught between 2 identities, once a proud, ruthless people who paid the iron price for their spoils, now a subdued colony paying taxes to King's Landing. The gray seas still crashed against the black rocks, storms still swept the coasts, and the tang of salt still marked the air. But the men who walked those shores were changed by war, forced to comply with an authority they had scorned for generations. Their new overlords wore the crown's stag banner, and their keeps were manned by foreign soldiers. High on the ramparts of the rebuilt Pike, a mainland-style tower rose overlooking the sea. There, Governor Renford Baratheon would sometimes stand, gazing out at the waves, wondering if the next generation would find a better way to live on these isles. He had no love for the place, truth be told. It was cold, dreary, and the scornful eyes of the locals never let him feel at ease. But the king had entrusted him with this responsibility, and each day he performed his duty, ensuring the taxes were collected, the laws enforced, and no defiant black sails appeared on the horizon. Below, in the old courtyard, a battered statue of Balon Greyjoy lay toppled. The sculpture had once stood watch over Pike's yard, depicting Balon in austere glory. Now it was rubble, left as a cautionary reminder. Passing soldiers sometimes spat on it, or used its remnants as a stepping stone when crossing the yard. Ironborn children would peek around the corner, solemn eyes taking in the sight of the fallen king. Some parents pulled them away, muttering that the mainland men might not appreciate them gawking at the old monument. Others let them see, perhaps hoping the children would remember. Far from that courtyard, across the sea in the rocky coves, a new generation learned fishing and honest trade, forced to find their place in a world where the old ironborn ways were relics. Some found acceptance. Others dreamed dark dreams of revenge. But for now, the realm was quiet. The king had declared the Iron Islands a crown colony, and so it was, forcibly remade in the shape of Robert Baratheon's will. In the annals of Westeros, men would argue for years if this truly ended the iron problem or merely delayed it. But in Robert's lifetime, the islands never again rose in open rebellion. Balon's final attempt had been snuffed out, and the price for such defiance had been paid in iron and blood. For better or worse, A new order had come to the salt-swept rocks of the west, and the banners that flew from the ramparts bore the crowned stag of House Baratheon, unquestioned masters of a people who once believed themselves unconquerable. So ended the story of the Iron Islands as they had always been known, proud, fierce, and free to raid the coasts. And so began a new chapter of their history. Pinned beneath the Iron Throne's unyielding rule, forcibly tied to the rest of the realm, parted from the old way of blood and salt, with every possibility that a day might come far in the future, when the tides shifted yet again. But that, as they say, would be a tale for another day. Time passed slowly among the stony shores and cold, brine-swept winds of the Iron Islands. In the 5th year after the Crown's conquest, as mainland rule grew as entrenched as barnacles on a hull, it sometimes seemed to the islanders that there had never been another way. Where once black sails had caught the fierce gusts of freedom, now a forest of masts stood in neat rows, the Crown's gold and black pennants snapping in the same sea breeze that once carried reavers out to glory. Every morning, the sun's weak rays crept over the horizon to reveal a people caught in limbo. Half subdued, half seething, unsure whether to accept the new yoke or yearn for lost days of salt and steel. Governor Renford Baratheon made his daily rounds in Pike's rebuilt corridors, footsteps echoing off stone walls that had once rung with the clamorous defiance of House Greyjoy. Here and there, he passed signs of the fortress's ongoing transformation. Mainland-style archways carved where battered ramparts had collapsed, windows designed to catch the breeze rather than merely keep out the relentless salt spray, rooflines bolstered with thick beams that could withstand storms as mighty as those in Storm's End. In the courtyard below, crowned soldiers drilled in formation, stiff and precise, an alien sight beneath Pike's jagged silhouette. Renford did not relish his role, but neither did he shirk it. King Robert had tasked him with keeping the colony in hand, and each day he reminded himself that duty came before comfort. He had never seen himself as an extraordinary leader. He was a distant cousin to the Baratheon main line, with none of the raw power that seemed to course through Robert's veins like thunder. Yet the king had chosen him for his reliability, not for brilliance. And so here he was, carrying out a duty that occasionally tasted of ashes in his mouth. He entered what had been Balon Greyjoy's old solar, now fitted with mainland furniture and dominated by a heavy oak table. The windows, set with thick iron bars to deter infiltration, looked out upon the surging sea. At that table awaited 2 men. One was Maester Fallis, older and graying, clad in the Citadel's chain that jingled whenever he shifted. The other was Donner Harlow, that opportunistic ironborn cousin whose loyalties now firmly rested with the Crown's administration. Renford inclined his head in greeting, and they began the business of the day. Reports had arrived from Harlow Isle of a new rumor, an itinerant group of drowned men preaching that a Kraken Messiah would arise from the waves to liberate the Ironborn. Fallis read the letter in a neutral tone, his voice gravelly. Donner shifted uncomfortably, for he had cousins among the Harlows who were staunch traditionalists. Renford sighed. I thought we had stamped out that talk. Didn't we hang 24 of those rebels last year? Donner spread his hands. Aye, Governor, we did. But you know the old faith. The drowned men scuttle into the tide pools like crabs. They vanish, then scurry forth somewhere else. If these are the same men, or new ones, who can say? They preach doom for the mainlanders. Some folk, especially the older ones, listen. They've got little to lose. Maester Fallis cleared his throat gently. Governor, the local garrison on Harlow is only 50 men. I recommend sending a second contingent at once to quell further gatherings. They may only be rumors, but discontent festers if left unchecked. And if we feed the hungry properly this winter, we might undercut the drowned men's hold on the small folk. Desperation is an ally to extremist voices. Renford pressed his lips together, leaning back in the stiff wooden chair. He ran his hand over the stubble on his chin. Very well, I'll dispatch more men. Donner, you'll coordinate with them. Root out this nonsense. I'm not telling them to slaughter peasants, mind, but if these preachers are inciting revolt, they must be arrested. Donner nodded. It will be done. Fallis wrote notes in a cramped script, then set down his quill. He hesitated a moment, then ventured, Governor, I might also suggest establishing a local council on each isle, some manner of representation. If the small folk have an avenue to air their grievances, they might be less inclined to turn to fanatics promising them liberation. Renford gave a short laugh. Representation? Fallies? Where do you think we are, the free cities? The king wants these isles quiet, not filled with chatter about local councils. We have landed lords, Harlow, good brother, the rest, and they're already more than enough trouble. Fallis lowered his gaze. I simply think giving them a voice might be prudent in the long run. Even the Targaryens burned Harrenhal to the ground, Renford snapped, though not unkindly. But your point is taken. That's enough for now. He waved them away, and the men filed out, leaving him alone with the hush of old ghosts. For a time, he stared at the thick bars over the windows, wondering if the ironborn still believed they could break them. Of course they did. The question was whether or not they'd ever muster the power to try. In the village of Lordsport, life fared better than in most corners of the Isles. Once the seat of House Botley, the settlement had grown into a modest hub for trade, what little trade the region could muster. Mainland merchants set up stalls in a small market square, hawking everything from salted cod to rough-spun linens, from cheap steel tools to casks of wine that tasted suspiciously diluted. Ironborn fisherfolk docked their new skiffs each afternoon, unloading nets full of herring or pollock to sell at regulated prices, all under the watchful eye of crown officials. Now, in the midst of the 5th year's autumn, the market bustled quietly. The air carried a tang of brine and rotting seaweed, but also the sizzling aroma of fish spitted over open fires. Crown soldiers patrolled the docks in pairs, wearing Baratheon livery. Children darted between the stalls, heedless of the tension that lingered at the edges of every adult's gaze. One such child was a wiry boy named Gorman, the son of a local boat builder who had found new employment building small cogs for the crown. The father might resent working under mainland overseers, but Gorman reveled in the daily hustle, chasing gulls and pestering the fishwives for scraps. At midday, Gorman paused near a rough-hewn wooden kiosk where a new septon preached the faith of the Seven. This septon, Serradio, from the Reach, wore the flowing robes of his order. He stood on a crate, calling out to passers-by, "The Mother's mercy blesses all who would accept it, the Father's justice, the warrior's courage. Turn from the darkness of the past and join the realm in faith." Most islanders scowled or hurried by. A few mainland folk listened politely. Man lingered, curiosity shining in his young eyes. He knew of the drowned god from his grandmother's stories. Dark, cold prayers said in the surf at dusk, and he'd watched mainland men kneel before carved statues of the Seven, each representing some higher virtue. The boy had no strong preference for either. He was more interested in the swirl of color and sound that had taken root in Lordsport, the septon's robes, the glint of steel on soldiers' belts, the laughter of merchants telling tall tales. Suddenly, a pair of old ironborn men passed by the kiosk and spat near Septon Serradio's feet. One said aloud, "Keep your foreign gods, puppet. We bow to the sea, not to your statues." Serradio stiffened, but a soldier intervened before matters could escalate. The men moved on, muttering curses. Gorman watched them go, then glanced back at the septon, who was trembling slightly. For all the talk of mainland might, here was a man who wore no sword. Perhaps he was braver than he looked, or perhaps he was a fool. Gorman, hearing his name called by his father, ran off to the docks, leaving the tension behind. Such scenes repeated daily throughout the Isles. Mainland zeal and administration colliding with the sullen pride of the locals. Most ended with muttered curses rather than violence, for the crown's retribution was famously swift. Yet each small confrontation left behind a kernel of resentment, adding to the quiet tinder that threatened to smolder into open flame. Donner Harlow, returning to Harlow Isle as instructed, found the atmosphere there thicker with tension than usual. Harlow was among the largest of the islands, dominated by deep inlets and bleak, rolling hills. The castle of 10 Towers loomed on the horizon, though the main seat had been partially confiscated by the crown for use as a local administrative outpost. The rightful lord, Roderick Harlow, once known as the Reader, had died in the aftermath of Balon Greyjoy's rebellion, leaving no direct heir with enough influence to resist the mainland. The crown had allowed certain distant cousins to remain in partial control, provided they remain loyal. When Donner arrived with a small complement of crown soldiers, he found 10 towers subdued. The thick stone walls bore fresh pockmarks from the final days of the war, and one entire tower had collapsed under siege bombardment, leaving a ragged stump that crumbled a bit more each year. A half-ruined library lurked behind, said to contain volumes once treasured by Lord Roderick. Now most were rotted or water-stained. The new steward, a mainland man named Garrod Tarley, a distant relative of the Tarleys of Horn Hill, lacking inheritance prospects, greeted Donner stiffly in the courtyard. Donner dismounted from his horse, a mainland breed ill-suited to the rocky terrain, and brushed off the dust from his cloak. "I came as the governor bid me," he said. "Are the rumors of a drowned man sect proven?" Garrod nodded. "Aye, they gather in the ruins of Harag's Watch, some old tower by the western cliffs. We've had scouts out for days. They speak of a promised one, some kraken unbound, who will lead them to drive out the foreigners. Rubbish, but it's stirring the small folk. My men tried to take them unawares, but these men are slippery as eels. They slip into the surf or vanish into sea caves. We haven't cornered them yet." Donner rubbed his temples. "A warren of sea caves, no doubt. Then we'll starve them out. Seal the caves by land, blockade the shore from the sea with a handful of small boats. They can't hold out forever." He sensed Garrod's discomfort. Mainland men rarely relished hunts through tidal caves, especially ones that might be flooded at high tide. The ironborn rebels would have every advantage in such dank labyrinths. Yet, to preserve order, they had little choice. "We'll do as you suggest," Garrod said at last. "Though I've heard rumors they have a few old reavers among them, men who once sailed with Victorian Greyjoy. They won't die easy." Donner shrugged. "We have crossbows and discipline. That will have to suffice. When do we leave?" "At dawn." Donner nodded. "May the drowned god help them if they resist," he said wryly, though the words rang hollow. Part of him, raised on stories of ironborn glory, loathed seeing his countrymen hunted. But Donner had chosen his side, and the side that paid coin and offered security was the crown. So he swallowed his misgivings and prepared for the next day's confrontation. Meanwhile, across the sea in Winterfell, Theon Greyjoy knelt in the godswood, gazing into the still surface of the black pool beneath the heart tree. Nearly 10 years had passed since he had become Eddard Stark's ward hostage, truly. Balon's death still hovered in Theon's memory like a bruise that never faded. He had grown from a boy into a lean young man, adept at archery, skilled with a sword, never quite at ease. The northern climate had seeped into his bones, but his heart felt forever adrift between the old ways and the new. He often accompanied Robb Stark on hunts, shared feasts with the Stark family, teased Bran, traded barbs with Arya, smiled with Sansa. Yet inside, a quiet doubt gnawed at him. What was he, truly? The last scion of a defeated house that no longer even ruled its homeland. The Iron Islands were a crown colony, an occupied territory, and he was a Greyjoy in name only. Some nights he dreamt of waves crashing on rocky shores, of longships slicing through the foam. He would wake to the sound of wind in the tall pines, the frigid air of the north stinging his skin. He had heard scattered rumors from travelers about the changes in the Isles, how mainland officials governed from Pike, how the drowned men were hounded, how local traditions waned under the watch of Baratheon soldiers. Though Theon told himself he did not care. After all, the Ironborn had cost him his father. He sometimes felt a pang of regret. He had no illusions that House Greyjoy might rise again. But was that truly the end of the story? So what did that make him? Ned Stark's voice broke the hush of the godswood. "Theon," he said calmly, "what troubles you?" Theon looked up at the Lord of Winterfell. Ned's eyes were kind but somber. The heart tree's carved face loomed behind him, red sap trickling from the eyes. Theon hesitated, then managed a half laugh. "I was just thinking about home," I suppose. Ned nodded. He knew better than most how strong the pull of home could be, how the North shaped him as thoroughly as the swirling snows. I've not kept you from returning, he said softly. You've chosen to remain, though I understand if it vexes you. Theon shrugged. There's little to return to from what I hear. A crown colony, heavily guarded by men from the Stormlands, the Westerlands, the Crownlands. My name means less than nothing there. Eddard's mouth tightened. I wish I could tell you otherwise. The islands are not what they once were, for good or ill. But you are not nothing, Theon. You are a ward of Winterfell, and I consider you almost a son. I know that doesn't fill the emptiness you feel, but I would not have you think yourself worthless. Theon averted his eyes, a sudden surge of conflicting emotions rising in his chest. Love for the Stark's ward with the sense that he was betraying his father's memory by adapting to the North. Balon Greyjoy had died cursing his own child's weakness. Theon often asked himself whether his father would have preferred him dead at Pike's side, hammered into the ground by Robert's fury. Thank you, my lord, he muttered. Truly, you've done more for me than my own father ever did. Ned placed a hand on Theon's shoulder. I only hope that one day you can reconcile who you are with who you wish to be. Then he turned and departed, leaving Theon alone beneath the ancient red leaves. He stared at his reflection a while longer, thinking of the ocean that he had not seen since he was a boy. Perhaps he would never see it again. Yet in his veins salt still stirred. Far to the south, in King's Landing, the royal court paid little heed to the daily burdens of the Iron Islands. King Robert Baratheon had grown heavier in both belly and jowl, his once mighty frame softened by wine and feasts. He still possessed a lion's roar of laughter and a bear's capacity for drink, but his old scars ached, and his temper flared unpredictably. On many days, he preferred hawking, hunting, or whoring to the tedious business of ruling. Thus he left the details of the Iron Islands and much else to his council. Grand Maester Pycelle, stooped and wheezing, occasionally reminded the king that stationing a permanent garrison so far from the Crownlands was expensive. Peter Baelish, the master of coin, assured them that the shortfall could be covered by increased tariffs on iron ore, fish exports, and tolls from newly safe shipping lanes. Varys the Spider, ever watchful, commented that the occupation dissuaded other would-be rebels from challenging Baratheon authority. The king would grunt and wave a hand, saying, "Fine, fine, let them handle it." Only when rumors of renewed unrest reached a certain pitch did Robert scowl and call for more resources to be sent. He had hammered Balon Greyjoy into dust. He would not see the Isles slip out of his grasp through negligence. And so more coin was allocated to the governor's coffers, more ships were dispatched to patrol the waters, and more mainland soldiers were rotated onto the stony beaches. Meanwhile, other problems brewed in the realm. Whispers of Targaryens stirring across the narrow sea, talk of Dothraki Khalasars on the move, tensions with Dorne. The Iron Islands, subdued and silent, ranked low on the king's immediate concerns. That silence, however, was not as absolute as it appeared. Euron Greyjoy, Balon's exiled brother, had vanished into the eastern seas long before the final subjugation. Rumors placed him in the Basilisk Isles, in Slaver's Bay, in Volantis, or sailing with corsairs in the Jade Sea. Some insisted he was dead, his body thrown overboard after crossing pirate kings. But once every few years, a rumor would emerge that a ship with a black eye sigil on its sails had been spotted in some distant port, or that a man calling himself Crow's Eye boasted of sowing chaos across the seas. The mainland authorities dismissed these rumors as ghost stories. The crown had thoroughly broken the Greyjoy line, leaving only Theon, who was no threat, and the old uncles who had either died or been captured. Even if Euron lived, he had no resources with which to challenge the might of the entire realm. Yet in hidden corners of the Isles, when the night was dark and the wind howled, some ironborn whispered that Euron the Crow's Eye would return to feed the foreigners to the drowned god. A child's bedtime terror or a rebel's dream of vengeance. No one could say which. For now, the real threat took shape on Harlow's cliffs in the battered tower known as Harag's Watch. Before dawn the next day, Donner Harlaw rode at the head of 50 crown soldiers, with Garrod Tarly and another score bringing up the rear, to encircle the old watchtower that perched precariously above a rocky cove. The path leading up was narrow and lined with jagged outcroppings. Below, waves smashed relentlessly against the cliff face, sending white spray soaring into the air. The men moved cautiously, aware that they were dealing with a cornered group of zealots. The drowned men might be few in number, but they knew the cliffs intimately. A single rockslide or a few archers with good aim could send half the crown's force to a watery grave. Donner signaled for a small contingent of crossbowmen to fan out on the high ground, while Tarly's men approached from below. A keen-eyed scout reported movement in the tower ruins. Figures in tattered cloaks stood in the half-collapsed doorway, brandishing axes and spears. As soon as the crown forces came into view, a voice bellowed out above the roar of the surf. "Ironborn, stand with us or perish as thralls. The drowned god rages against the foreign tyrants." Donner recognized the speaker by the voice alone, a man called Harwin Salttongue, rumored to have once reaved in Victarion's fleet. The soldier's words were peppered with salt-laced curses. A half-dozen more men and women appeared behind him, similarly armed. Among them stood 2 or 3 robed figures, drowned men-priests, hair damp and clothes crusted with salt. They lifted driftwood staffs carved with the shape of krakens. Donner pulled up on his reins, turning to Garrod Tarly. "I'll offer them a chance to surrender, as the governor commands. If they refuse, we attack." Garrod nodded, though it was clear he did not relish the bloodshed to come. Donner took a deep breath, then cupped his hands around his mouth. "You there, men of Harlow, lay down your arms. In the name of King Robert, I promise clemency if you yield immediately." Harwin Salttongue spat into the wind. "Clemency from a traitor? You wear Harlow's name but lick the usurper's boots." One of the robed priests stepped forward, holding aloft a dripping sword. It gleamed oddly in the pale morning light. "The tide is with us," he cried. "The drowned god shall raise a wave of vengeance to wash away these false kings. Will you not stand with your own blood?" Donner's face went pale. He had anticipated curses, not appeals to kinship. He felt the eyes of the crowned soldiers on him, aware that any hesitation might be read as treason. Steeling himself, he gripped the hilt of his sword and shouted back, "Your cause is lost. If you fail to yield, you'll die. There's no more to be said." He raised a hand, and the crossbowmen let fly a volley. The projectiles whistled through the air. Some clattered off the stone doorway, but a few found flesh. One drowned man pitched forward, bolt embedded in his shoulder. Another rebel cried out as a bolt struck his leg. Yet they did not scatter as ordinary bandits might. They roared defiance, surging out onto the narrow path, brandishing axes. The crowned soldiers moved in disciplined ranks, spears bristling. Donner dismounted swiftly, drawing his sword, though he let the foot soldiers close first. The stone walkway was slick with sea spray, treacherous for heavy boots. Steel clashed, and the shrill cry of a wounded soldier rang out. Harwin Salttongue swung a massive axe, splitting a crowned man's shield. Another rebel plunged a spear into a second soldier's belly. But discipline and numbers told quickly. Garrod Tarly's men, approaching from the flank, trapped the rebels against the tower's wall. Crossbows loosed a second volley, sending men tumbling from the path into the roaring sea below. The robed priests fought with a kind of wild fervor, chanting half-sung prayers to the drowned god. But one by one they fell to disciplined spear thrusts. Harwin, the last man standing near the doorway, took a crossbow bolt to the neck, blood spraying in a crimson arc as he toppled. It was all over within minutes. The watchers from the battered tower, women and children, perhaps loyal to the cause or simply trapped there, screamed as the crowned soldiers stormed inside. They found little but squalor and stale provisions. A large wooden trough, evidently used for drowned god baptisms, stood in the center of the ruined hall. The water was fouled and reeking. Several men tried to hide in a half-collapsed undercroft, but Tarly's men dragged them out. Donner wiped sweat and sea spray from his brow, surveying the carnage. The mission was brutal but successful. The drowned men's nest on Harlow was broken. A few survivors were chained, to be hauled back to 10 Towers and eventually on to Pike for judgment. Soldiers rummaged through the tower, piling up weapons. Even as a sense of relief flickered in Donner, a kernel of unease lodged deeper in his chest. These rebels were not bandits seeking coin. They were men and women possessed by fervor. Killing them only inflamed that fervor in the hearts of others. He looked at the broken body of Harwin Salttongue, once a famed reaver, bleeding out on the threshold. The man's sightless eyes stared into the sky as gulls circled overhead, screeching. The tide rolled in, spattering foam across the stones. In that moment, Donner felt a pang of something like shame, but he mastered himself, reminding his conscience that it was kill or be killed, that these fanatics would have toppled the entire colony into chaos if left unchecked. He turned to Garrod Tarley. "We'll return to 10 Towers, see if there are any more pockets of these zealots. Then we'll send word to Governor Renford that Harlow is secured." Garrod nodded wearily. Yes, secured. For now. They set about their grim work with the efficiency of men who knew there was no room for doubt. Back at Pike, Governor Renford received the news of the successful crackdown with a measured nod. "Well done," he told the messenger. "At least that's one less cell of insurgents." He ordered a small cask of ale sent to Garrod Tarley's men as a reward, a gesture that might bolster morale. Yet he could not shake the feeling that for every head of the Hydra they cut off, more might grow elsewhere. Maester Fallis, reading over the reports, sighed. Such unrest could be mitigated if the colony's harshness were eased, he ventured. It's the bitterness of defeat that drives them to these desperate acts. If we allowed them a modicum of self-rule, Renford snorted. Let them reintroduce the practice of raiding, you mean? Or enthrone a leftover Greyjoy? Don't be naive, Fallis. I speak not of reaving but of cultural leeway, the Maester said, gently insistent. In some past conquests, the Targaryens allowed local lords to retain authority so long as they acknowledged the crown. That peace lasted generations. The governor set down the letter. That was a different time, and the Targaryens had dragons to enforce compliance. Robert wants them broken for good. We can't risk giving them an inch. He hesitated, though, regarding Fallis with a searching gaze. Do you truly believe a softer approach would quell them? Fallis exhaled. Not all of them, but many ordinary folk want only to fish, farm, and survive. If we keep starving them of dignity, imposing mainland officials at every turn, restricting every aspect of their old life, some will always listen to the drowned men's call. Give them small freedoms, and that call loses its power. Renford rubbed the bridge of his nose. And if I do that, the king may accuse me of leniency, or the next wave of reavers might slip through the cracks. Fallis, I'm not unsympathetic, but my duty is to ensure the Isles remain loyal. Fear is a stronger tool than reason, especially with a people so stubborn. Fallis bowed his head. I understand your position, Governor, yet it is my duty as Maester to offer counsel. I will not stop. Nor should you, Renford said, rising from his chair. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to sign off on new shipments for Lordsport. Let us hope there's peace for a while. Over the following year, pockets of insurgency continued to flare and subside. Each time, Crown forces descended with ruthless efficiency, capturing or killing the small bands that dared raise steel against them. The drowned men found themselves pushed further underground, forced to conduct rituals in hidden coves or half-submerged sea tunnels. Many of their priests died at the end of nooses, their drowned robes flapping in the wind. The ironborn population at large observed these events with grim resignation, burying resentment in stoic silence. Some small folk turned away from the old ways completely, finding life easier if they at least pretended to accept the faith of the Seven or the mainland's laws. Others lung to the drowned god in secret, too afraid or too proud to yield. Meanwhile, mainland influences grew more visible. Lordsport established a rudimentary harbor authority that collected tariffs on incoming and outgoing goods. A modest sept was completed, with a tall wooden spire that soared over the squat houses. At Pike, Governor Renford occasionally hosted bannermen from the Reach or the Westerlands, forging trade agreements that funneled fish and iron ore out of the islands in exchange for grain, cloth, and luxuries like wine or spices. The garrison rotated twice a year, ensuring that no single contingent grew too comfortable or too entangled with local ties. This last policy had a dual purpose: to prevent mainland soldiers from going native, and also to ensure that any bribes or corruption among them might be cut short. Even so, some soldiers inevitably formed friendships, or deeper bonds, with local women, fathering children who bore a confusing mixture of mainland and ironborn heritage. These children grew up bridging two worlds, though acceptance by either was never guaranteed. Over time, they might become a new class altogether, one that recognized the king's rule but still respected the sea's call. For the old ironborn nobility, life under the crown colony was a perpetual balancing act. Those who had bent the knee after Balon's fall found themselves in half-chains, forced to serve as the crown's tax collectors in their own lands. Lords such as Goodbrother or Blacktide outwardly complied, but behind closed doors curses flew. They bristled at the humiliations. Mainland men auditing their ledgers, mainland soldiers garrisoned in their halls, mainland judges settling disputes among the small folk. The old lords were left with titles but precious little power, overshadowed by the appointed officials who answered directly to Pike. A few younger nobles adapted more readily. Among them was Lady Yara Harlow, not to be confused with Asha Greyjoy of another timeline, a cousin of Donner's who had a keen mind for commerce. She struck deals with merchants from the Westerlands, using her family's knowledge of the seas around Harlow to guide ships safely into hidden coves brimming with fish. Profitable alliances rose from these efforts, and mainland officials rewarded her with minor privileges, licensed to sail a handful of cogs or manage local tariffs. She thrived, even as some of her kin denounced her as a collaborator. To her mind, it was not collaboration but survival, and a means to secure a future for the next generation of Harlows. On the mainland, however, the Iron Islands rarely garnered a second thought. King Robert's hunts and feasts, the intrigues of the Red Keep, the alliances and feuds among great houses, these overshadowed the distant archipelago. People spoke of the Isles only to remark that piracy had decreased or to praise the new maritime routes. The realm's commerce flourished in the western seas, no longer menaced by black-sailed longships. Those who remembered the old days of reaving might occasionally remind a young merchant that once, no ship dared sail unguarded past the Iron Islands. Now, they rarely needed more than a small guard detail. If anything, the news that did leak from the Isles reinforced a sense of mainland superiority. Stories of savage drowned men, quickly put down by the king's justice. The moral was always the same. The reavers had reaped what they sowed, and the crown had tamed a wild land. Few mainland lords worried about the hatred simmering behind the islanders' downcast eyes. In the 7th year of the colony, the first significant sign of change occurred that did not revolve around conflict. A group of ironborn shipwrights, led by an old craftsman named Baron the Ropemaster, proposed the construction of a new class of vessel suitable for both fishing and cargo transport in shallow waters. These ships, slightly larger than the standard longboats, featured a broad hull and a shallow draft. They were designed to carry heavier loads along rocky coastlines without risking the deep waters. Governor Renford, initially skeptical, authorized a small sum to build a prototype in Lordsport. When that prototype, named the Saltwind, was completed, it proved a success. Faster than an equivalent cog, more stable than a longboat, it impressed mainland merchants who visited the Isles. Soon, the governor commissioned an entire batch of Saltwinds for local use, awarding contracts to those ironborn families who cooperated with the crown. The project breathed new life into a battered economy. Ironborn saw that with cunning and compliance, they could still excel at the one thing they had always done best: building and sailing ships. And the crown recognized that harnessing ironborn skill might yield greater profits than simply subjugating them with an iron fist. Maester Fallis quietly celebrated the development, seeing in it a path toward mutual benefit. "Commerce is a gentler chain than a sword," he said to Donner Harlow one day, as they toured the Lordsport docks. "If the islanders can profit through cooperation, fewer will turn to rebellion." Donner eyed the bustling shipyard, where scores of ironborn carpenters hammered planks into frames. "We'll see," he murmured. "Profit is fine, but pride is wounded. Some men can't stomach building ships they aren't allowed to arm." Valis nodded. "True enough, but men must eat, and the old reaving ways fed fewer mouths than you might think." Donner offered a half-smile. He had participated in countless crackdowns on reavers, but he also remembered the fierce joy in the eyes of his grandparents when they spoke of ironborn independence. He was torn, and Valis' words gave him the smallest flicker of hope that a middle ground might exist. Yet for every sign of progress, old wounds lurked just beneath the surface. On Great White, the largest island, a minor feud erupted between mainland soldiers and local workers when a soldier allegedly assaulted an ironborn woman. The incident sparked a bloody brawl that left 5 men dead, among them a mainland officer. Governor Renford cracked down harshly, executing 3 ironborn laborers found guilty of murder and sending the soldier in question back to King's Landing for disciplinary action. Whispers claimed the soldier received only a token punishment, stoking further resentment among the islanders, who saw the imbalance of justice. Renford's own letters to the crown became more pointed. He pleaded for stricter discipline among the men posted there. "You send men who think themselves above the local populace," he wrote to the Master of Laws. "They commit abuses that fuel resentment. If we are to keep the Isles stable, the Crown must ensure punishment is administered fairly." The response from King's Landing, penned by an undersecretary to the hand, was polite but vague. Resources were stretched, it said, and the king had many pressing concerns. The matter would be addressed in due time. All the while, small changes continued to shape the islands in ways that no single decree could reverse. Children with mainland surnames and ironborn blood played in tidipools, discovering starfish and crabs, learning to speak both the common tongue with a mainland accent and the guttural dialect of the old ironborn. The local lords, battered into compliance, learned the labyrinth of crown regulations and found ways to game the system, pocketing a few extra coins here, forging minor alliances there. Trade routes expanded, bringing goods from the Arbor and Lordsport, as well as occasional shipments from across the narrow sea. The architecture, fashion, and even the food began to blend mainland customs with local practicality. Salted fish stewed with southern spices, houses with reinforced roofs to withstand the violent storms but chimneys shaped in the manner of the Westerlands. Like slow-moving tectonic plates, the Isles were drifting into the orbit of the rest of Westeros, losing bits of their old isolation. Yet no one was certain whether this assimilation could ever be complete. Ironborn identity had once been as unyielding as the stone beneath their feet, the salt in their veins. Now, with each passing year, that identity found itself chipped and worn by the unrelenting tide of foreign rule. It was in the 9th year of the colony that King Robert Baratheon announced a grand tour of his realm. By then, he was a heavier, wearier man, but still prone to bursts of exuberance. He declared it high time he visited every corner of the 7 kingdoms and the crown colony, so that the small folk might behold their king in person. Courtiers whispered that it was an excuse to feast and hunt across Westeros at the crown's expense, but no one dared say so to Robert's face. Preparations were made for the royal progress, and though it would take many months, eventually the plan was for the king to set foot on the Iron Islands. Governor Renford received word of this with a mixture of excitement and dread. On one hand, the king's visit might affirm the crown's commitment, which could translate into more resources. On the other, a single misstep, any show of dissent, could enrage Robert and bring brutal reprisals. Renford ordered every outpost to root out possible trouble. The men scoured villages for hidden reavers, forced suspicious persons to produce travel papers, and tightened security at Pike. Ravens flew to the local lords, summoning them to present themselves in loyal submission when the king arrived. In the streets of Lordsport, the news ignited a swirl of emotions. Mainland merchants looked forward to the potential for lavish spending that accompanied a royal train. Innkeepers hoped for coin. Ironborn natives worried that the king's presence might provoke restless souls to lash out, do something rash in the name of the drowned god or the Greyjoy line. At the docks, some men hissed that Robert was the murderer of their rightful king, a tyrant swaggering among the graves of those he had butchered. Others shrugged. The king had won. Better to keep one's head down. As the weeks passed and the date of Robert's landing drew near, tensions rose. Governor Renford left nothing to chance. He demanded a careful arrangement. The king's ship would sail into Lordsport under heavy guard. The local lords would greet him in a formal ceremony. The king would spend only a few days touring Pike and the major sites, then depart. Soldiers would be on high alert the entire time, and any sign of rebellion would be crushed on sight. One late spring evening, as gulls circled overhead in the pinkish twilight, an unexpected visitor arrived at Pike. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, accompanied by Theon Greyjoy. They rode up to the fortress on weary horses, having crossed by ship from the rills in the north. Ned had come in advance of the king's progress to ensure safe passage and, perhaps, to help manage Theon's presence if Robert insisted on parading him as proof of House Greyjoy's end. Governor Renford was somewhat surprised. He greeted Ned with courtesy, though his eyes flicked often to Theon. The boy, no, the young man, looked older than Renford remembered, with sharper features and a wariness in his gaze that reminded Renford of Balon Greyjoy's final defiance. But Theon bowed politely, wearing the colors of House Stark. They retired to the newly built Great Hall for a small feast. The fare was plain: salted fish, black bread, a lean roast pig from the mainland. Ned spoke little, though he studied the changes in Pike. Where once precarious rope bridges had linked the towers, now there were sturdy stone causeways, lined with arrow slits to deter infiltration. A mainland banner of the crowned stag hung in place of the kraken. The air smelled faintly of mortar and newly cut timber, overlaid with that eternal tang of sea salt. Midway through the meal, Renford addressed Theon directly for the first time. "You return at last to your father's seat," he said, the subtlest of barbs in his tone. Theon swallowed, meeting the governor's gaze. "It no longer is my father's seat," he replied, "and I return only because Lord Stark requested my presence." Renford inclined his head. "True enough. Does it pain you?" Ned frowned, as though to intervene, but Theon waved him off. "Aye, it does," Theon admitted. "But I know what happened here and why. If you fear I've come to stoke rebellion, you're mistaken." Renford tapped the table with his gauntlet. "No one said you would, lad. The king will arrive soon. He might wish you by his side as some demonstration of loyalty. Are you prepared for that?" Theon's jaw tightened. "If that's what he wishes, yes. I know which side I stand on." Ned shifted in his seat. "He has stood by House Stark since boyhood. He is no threat. I hope the governor won't question his good faith." Renford offered a thin smile. "I question everything, Lord Stark. That's how I keep this rock in line. But no, I don't presume Theon means trouble. Better him here under watchful eyes than away. Perhaps he can remind any ironborn with illusions about House Greyjoy's return that they have no rightful leader." Theon's cheeks burned, but he said nothing. The conversation turned to the king's itinerary, the security arrangements, the feasting plans. Theon stared at the flickering torchlight on the walls, remembering the gloom of Pike as a child. He had not thought to return, especially not like this. In his dreams, he had sometimes seen himself reclaiming his birthright, commanding Pike's halls. But that was a fantasy from another age, thoroughly extinguished by the crown's occupation. In the following days, Theon roamed the castle. He walked the causeways that replaced the old rope bridges he had once feared to cross as a small boy. The new stone paths felt alien, lacking the sense of danger that had defined Pike's layout. He ventured out into the courtyard, where mainland soldiers sparred, and glimpsed the place where Balon Greyjoy had fallen, hammered down by Robert. The flagstones bore no trace of his father's blood. Time had washed that memory away. He also observed the changes in the local population around Pike. Some recognized him, or at least guessed his identity, for he wore the Stark colors but bore a Greyjoy's face. They eyed him with curiosity or contempt. One old woman hissed curses under her breath. He caught the words "traitor spawn." A group of children gazed at him with open curiosity, whispering to each other about the mainland lord who was also an ironborn by birth. Theon forced himself to keep walking, feeling each stair like a dagger. He had never felt more uncertain in his own skin. Meanwhile, Ned Stark spent much of his time speaking with Governor Renford, sharing northern intelligence on potential smuggling routes or any sign that the islanders might attempt to slip away and reeve beyond the blockade. Ned was thorough, and if part of him questioned the morality of the occupation, he kept those doubts to himself. He had come to accept that the Iron Islands were best contained, for the good of the realm. Some nights, however, he would walk along the newly fortified sea walls, the wind tangling in his gray-brown hair, recalling the day he and Robert had stood side by side to crush the first Greyjoy rebellion. He remembered the sight of Theon as a boy, trembling but trying to hide it, offered as a hostage to keep Balon docile. It had all led here to a fortress that was half mainland bastion, half ghost of old Pike. Finally, word came that King Robert's royal fleet was sighted off the horizon. The watchers on the tower signaled with horn blasts, and the entire garrison snapped to attention. Robert had chosen to sail from Lordsport, bringing a retinue that included the Queen and a swarm of courtiers. Noble ladies, knights, squires, and hangers-on crowded the decks of a dozen ships. Robert himself rode aboard the royal galley Fury, its golden stag figurehead gleaming in the sun. The rest of the ships flew Baratheon banners or those of allied houses. As they approached Lordsport, onlookers gathered along the piers. The local garrison formed a ceremonial line, and the mainland merchants prepared for a flood of custom. Half of the crowd was anxious or sullen, the other half curious or hopeful that a royal visit would inject coin into the local pockets. Soldiers trumpeted Robert's arrival with bright notes from copper horns. Down the gangplank strode the king, clad in a fur-trimmed cloak despite the mild weather, his face red from drink or sun or both. Cersei Lannister followed, golden hair catching the light, eyes scanning the crowd with cool detachment. Behind them came a small tide of courtiers, the giant Ser Gregor Clegane in black plate, the King's Guard in white cloaks, Littlefinger with his sly grin, Grand Maester Pycelle wheezing as he disembarked, and a host of lesser lords. Governor Renford, flanked by Ned Stark and Theon, stepped forward. Renford knelt briefly. "Your Grace, the Iron Islands welcome you." Robert let out a booming laugh. "So they do, I'm sure. Rise, cousin." He embraced Renford in a rough bear hug. Then he turned to Ned, clapping him on the shoulder. "Ned, you old dog, it's good to see your face. Did you sail all the way from Winterfell for this?" Ned smiled faintly. "I did. Safer with friends here, I thought." Robert snorted. Well, we'll see about that." He eyed Theon. "Gods, you've grown, boy. You shave yet?" Theon flushed, bowing. "I do, your grace." Robert grunted in amusement. "Ha! Hard to remember you as anything but a scrawny lad. Well, you'll stand with us at Pike, then. Show them how well the Starks keep their wards." There was no venom in his tone, only the casual arrogance of a man who'd triumphed over Theon's house. Courtiers and onlookers parted as the king's retinue moved inland. Governor Renford had arranged a line of horses and carriages to carry them to Pike. The Grand Progress had arrived on the Iron Islands, an event that some had thought would never happen. Whispers passed among the islanders. Would the king parade Theon through Pike as a trophy? Would Robert reaffirm the harsh rule or lighten it with new decrees? The journey to Pike took half a day along rough coastal roads. Periodically, Robert would stop to jest with Ned or demand a skin of wine. Cersei, riding in a carriage, said little, her green eyes flicking with boredom or disdain. The King's Guard kept watch for any sign of ambush, but none came. The islanders, though not happy to see the king, were not suicidal enough to strike his retinue in open daylight. When they reached Pike, the gates stood wide, mainland banners flanking the entrance. Governor Renford had prepared a feast in the newly renovated Great Hall, the best the Isles could offer: roast fish, bread, salted beef from the mainland, and local shellfish. Musicians played a halting tune, half mainland, half adapted from old ironborn rhythms. Robert roared approval at the sight of the battered fortress. "You've done well here, cousin," he said, marveling at the stone causeways and reinforced walls. feels almost like storm's end, but with more salt in the air. Renford inclined his head. We've striven to meet your expectations, Your Grace. The Isles have been secured thoroughly. Reavers are a dwindling breed. Trade is up. Taxes flow to the crown. All is well. Robert laughed, slapping a gauntlet on a table. Excellent. Maybe we should do this to half the realm. And Ned? Ned managed a polite smile, while courtiers chuckled nervously. Cersei's lips curved faintly as though in private amusement. The feast was lavish by Iron Island standards, but modest compared to the opulence of King's Landing. Robert downed cup after cup of wine, devouring large portions of roast and fish, boisterously demanding songs of victory. Some mainland bard tried to recall the epic of the Greyjoy Rebellion, praising Robert's defeat of Balon. The islanders in attendance sat stiff, their faces betraying little emotion. Theon felt as though he were floating outside his own body, hearing the minstrels mock his father's downfall. Ned placed a cautionary hand on his arm when Theon's expression grew too dark. At the feast's height, Robert leapt from his seat, staggering slightly. "Cousin Renford," he bellowed, "your king demands a tour of the castle tonight. Show me the spot where I hammered that old kraken's chest. I wish to see it with my own eyes again." Renford paled, glancing at Theon and Ned, but he could not refuse. "As you will, Your Grace." So the king, followed by an entourage of half-drunk lords, made their way through Pike's corridors, passing curious guardsmen. Robert insisted Theon accompany them, gesturing with a broad grin. "Come along, boy. Don't mope. Your father made his choices. You've made yours. All's well." Theon trailed in silence, trying not to boil over in fury. Ned walked beside him, silently warning him to keep composure. Torches lit their way as they entered a lower courtyard where the final battle had raged. The stones had been refitted, though some original pockmarks remained. Robert strode around, humming, until he found a certain spot near a patched section of wall. Here, he slammed a boot down. This was where Balon lay, if my memory's not clouded by time. The king's face clouded as he remembered the battle. "He gave me no choice," Robert muttered, perhaps to no one in particular. The fool. If he'd bent the knee properly. Then he shrugged, letting the memory pass. He turned to Theon. "You see, lad? No king but me stands on these isles now." Theon swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He bowed his head. "I see, Your Grace." Robert studied him a moment, then clapped him on the shoulder with a heavy hand. "Don't look so glum. The realm's at peace, thanks to that victory. And you're with the Starks, a fine family if ever there was one. Let your father's ghost rest." A hush fell, as though even the king's courtiers sensed the awkwardness. Ned quietly changed the subject, steering Robert away toward the next corridor. Theon let out a shaky exhale, feeling both relief and a hollow sense of shame. Part of him wanted to protest that his father was not just some old fool to be dismissed, but a man who had fought for what he believed was the ironborn right. Yet Theon also recalled how Balon had spat on him in the end. Torn between conflicting loyalties, Theon said nothing. The king's progress continued for another day, during which Robert visited Lordsport's harbor, marveling at the new Saltwind vessels, and dined with a handful of local lords who had come to greet him. He found their company dull compared to the raucous banter of the mainland lords. One or two tried to curry favor by promising to expand production of fish or iron or... Robert nodded absent-mindedly, more interested in whether the local brew could match northern ale. Cersei Lannister, for her part, glided through the visit like a cat among pigeons, bestowing smiles that never reached her eyes. She declared the fortress adequate and the local women unrefined. When she discovered the presence of Theon Greyjoy, she raised an eyebrow. "So the last kraken whelp returns to the nest," she mused. "How quaint." Theon bowed stiffly, ignoring her barbed tone. By the third day, Robert had had his fill of the colony. "I've seen enough," he declared, hungover from a night of heavy drinking. "This place is tamed. Good work, cousin. Keep it that way." He gestured at the harbor, We sail for the Westerlands on the morrow. I'm told Lord Tywin has arranged a feast that will put this one to shame." Renford exhaled in relief, promising to maintain the peace. The king roared laughter and slapped him on the back. "If they cause trouble, just send word. I'll come back with a hammer in one hand and dragonfire in the other, if I must." A grin crinkled his eyes, though who could say how much jest lay behind it. Then Robert left Pike with his queen and retinue, the entire flotilla departing Lordsport under fair weather. The horns sounded their farewell, and the islanders watched the royal sails shrink on the horizon. Governor Renford slumped in his seat once the king was gone, exhausted. The visit had passed without bloodshed or scandal. By that measure, it was a victory. Ned Stark prepared to depart soon as well, though he lingered for a few more days. Theon found himself standing upon Pike's ramparts, gazing out at the sea. A swirl of gulls dove into the waves in search of fish. He felt Ned approach. Theon did not turn at first, but spoke softly. "Seeing him here, hearing him talk about crushing my father, I suppose I knew it was inevitable, but it still stings." Ned set a hand on Theon's shoulder. "Robert sees the world plainly. Those who defy him must be destroyed. He does not dwell on the pain left behind. That is not an excuse, merely the way he is." Theon nodded. "I don't blame you, Lord Stark, nor do I entirely blame him. Father might have spared these isles the yoke if he had yielded truly." He clenched the rampart's cold stone. But seeing all this, mainland soldiers everywhere, local folk afraid to speak openly, is this truly better? Ned was silent for a moment. "I cannot answer that easily. I've seen the aftermath of ironborn raids. I've seen the sorrow they wrought on the mainland for centuries. So yes, in one sense, the realm is safer. But I know it costs the ironborn dearly." Theon let the hush stretch between them, the ocean wind lashing his hair about his face. "I belong neither here nor in the north," he said at last. "And yet I must stand somewhere, or I'll be torn apart." Ned squeezed his shoulder. "Stand with the Starks," he said gently. "You've grown up with us. We've been your family as best we could." Theon turned, meeting Ned's earnest gaze. For a moment, Theon's eyes flicked beyond the walls, to the endless expanse of sea that had once defined his people. Then he dipped his head. I will." 2 days later, Theon and Ned departed for Winterfell, leaving Pike behind once again. Governor Renford did not try to stop them. There was nothing to be gained by keeping Theon in the Isles. As the small boat ferried them to the ship, Theon glanced back at the fortress. He wondered if he would ever see it again, or if he even wanted to. The gulls screeched overhead, and the gray waters sloshed against the hull, but the fortress stood silent, an austere monument to old memories. Life on the Iron Islands returned to its uneasy normal. The king's visit had not changed the day-to-day dynamic. Mainland officials still governed, the local lords still chafed, the small folk struggled to survive under new taxes, and the rebellious few still schemed in secret. But now they bore the added insult of having seen the conqueror stride among them, drunk and triumphant, as though their proud heritage was little more than a curiosity. And so the cycle continued, years turning into a decade of occupation, with no sign of the crown relaxing its grip. If anything, the success of the colony emboldened some at court to suggest establishing similar direct rule in other troublesome regions. Yet for the time being, Robert was content to have proven his dominance over the Isles once and for all. He had hammered them into submission, ended House Greyjoy as a ruling line, and established Baratheon governance. The realm would know peace along its western coasts, at least from the Ironborn. Under that peace, a generation of children grew up never having known the old ways of reaving. Their fathers and grandfathers might tell them tales of black sails and salt wives, but they saw only regulated shipyards and mainland bureaucracy. Some adapted without complaint, learning new trades or serving as guardsmen under the crown's banner. Others resented it quietly, eyes lighting up whenever an old reaver's song was hummed in a tavern. The seeds of discontent did not vanish. They lay dormant, waiting for any spark of opportunity. Governor Renford's policies shifted gradually over time. On the advice of Maester Fallis, he allowed a few local councils to form, advisory bodies with no real power, but enough to let islanders feel heard. He cracked down on the worst abuses by mainland soldiers, insisting that discipline be enforced strictly. He even permitted some controlled worship of the drowned god to resume in public, as long as it did not call for rebellion. None of these measures made him popular with the ironborn, but they reduced friction enough to let the colony function. In the broader realm, other events loomed. Rumors of a Targaryen girl across the narrow sea with dragons, stories of supernatural threats in the far north, tension among the great houses that threatened to boil over. But these concerns seemed far from the wave-lashed shores of the Iron Islands. The colony endured, a testament to Robert's will, a living symbol of the consequences of defying the Iron Throne. Sometimes, in the darkest corners of half-collapsed keeps on Old Wyke or beneath the basalt cliffs of Great Wyke, a handful of ironborn outlaws still lit torches and gathered for secret rites, chanting for the drowned god to send them a Kraken king to shatter the foreign yoke. Their voices echoed against damp stone walls, lost amid the surge of the sea. No sign or wonder answered. The mainland ships continued their patrols, the governor's men roved the roads, and the islanders woke each morning to a new day under Baratheon rule. Thus it was that Robert Baratheon's conquest of the Iron Islands settled into a long, fraught peace. The Ironborn, once lords of the western seas, had been stripped of their sovereignty, their reaving culture outlawed, their proud house extinguished save for a single heir who wanted no part of them. And though their hearts still beat with salt and iron, they found themselves entombed by stone walls not of their making, forced to bow to a king who laughed at their old glories. The question that lingered unspoken was whether the drowned god or the passage of time might someday shift the tides again. For now, though, the waves rose and fell around these isles, crashing in endless rhythm against the rocks. Ships docked and sailed, men worked and prayed, children played. Life went on, the old ways relegated to memory or hidden corners. Robert's triumph had been made manifest in the daily routine of an occupied land, where each sunrise reminded them that the Iron Islands were no longer free but tethered to the realm by unbreakable chains of iron and fear. That was how it stood for the remainder of Robert's days, an unchanging testament to what happened when the hammer of the crown fell without mercy. Generations would pass before any dared challenge that again, if ever they did. The distant cry of gulls, the taste of salt on the wind, the lonely shadows of ruined towers. These became the silent witness to a conquered people, proud but broken, living in the shadow of a storm that had long since passed yet left them forever changed.